Sometimes life gives you everything you think you want, then takes it all away in a single heartbeat. Tom Callahan learned this the hard way when cancer stole his wife, leaving him alone to raise his 8-year-old daughter on a mechanic's wages. Then his estranged father died, and Tom inherited the old man's ranch in Wyoming. Everyone in town laughed at him. They called the place worthless dirt and said Tom was a fool for leaving his steady job. His little girl Emma needed stability, not some broken-down farm that hadn't made money in decades, but Tom had nowhere else to go. While cleaning out the old barn, his shovel hit something metal buried in the ground. He dug deeper and found a hidden room filled with gold bars worth $50 million. Why had his father kept this secret his whole life? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning Denver fog clung to Tom Callahan's windshield as he drove through the industrial district toward Murphy's Auto Repair for what would be his final day. His calloused hands gripped the steering wheel of his 15-year-old pickup truck, the same hands that had rebuilt countless engines and held his dying wife during her last moments 3 years ago. In the passenger seat, a stack of unopened letters bore his father's careful handwriting correspondence that had arrived monthly for over a decade, each envelope returned to sender unopened. Tom had built a good life in Denver, not glamorous, but steady, honest work that paid the bills and kept food on the table for Emma. He'd started at Murphy's right out of high school, working his way up from oil changes to head mechanic. Old Murphy treated him fair, gave him time off when Sarah got sick, and never once complained when Tom brought Emma to the shop on school holidays. The shop smelled of motor oil and coffee when Tom walked in that February morning. Murphy looked up from the counter, his weathered face creased with concern. "You sure about this, Tommy?" Murphy asked, using the name he'd called him for 20 years. "That ranch ain't worth the dirt it sits on. Your old man, God rest his soul, he wasn't exactly known for his business sense." Tom pulled off his work coveralls for the last time, hanging them on the peg where they'd lived for 2 decades. "I don't have much choice, Murphy. The rent's going up again, and Emma needs more than I can give her here. What's she think about all this?" Tom's face softened at the mention of his daughter, Emma Rose Callahan, 8 years old with her mother's green eyes and her father's stubborn streak. She'd taken the news better than he'd expected, probably because she trusted him completely, a trust that terrified him more than any financial uncertainty. "She thinks it's an adventure," Tom said. "Keeps asking if there'll be horses." Murphy chuckled despite himself. "Well, there might be. Probably dead ones, but horses nonetheless." He pulled an envelope from the cash register. "Your final check, plus a little extra. You ever change your mind, you got a job waiting here." Tom shook the old man's hand, feeling the weight of leaving behind the only stability he'd known since Sarah died. Outside, Denver hummed with its usual morning energy. People hurried to jobs they'd wake up to tomorrow. Secure in routines, Tom was about to abandon for a gamble on land he'd never seen. The apartment felt hollow as Tom packed their belongings into boxes. Not much to show for 32 years of living clothes, books, Emma's drawings covering every surface of the refrigerator, and Sarah's things he couldn't bring himself to sort through. The wedding photos still lined the mantel, Sarah's smile frozen in happier times when the future seemed certain and cancer was just a word in medical textbooks. Emma sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor, carefully placing her stuffed animals into a cardboard box. She'd inherited her mother's organizational skills, making neat piles of books and toys with the seriousness of a much older child. "Dad, tell me about Grandpa again," she said without looking up. Tom leaned against the door frame. He told her what little he knew, that Daniel Callahan owned a ranch in Wyoming, that they'd had some kind of falling out years ago, and that the man had died alone with no one but a lawyer at his funeral. The truth was more complicated. Daniel had left when Tom was 17, choosing a bottle over his family, and Tom had spent 15 years angry about it. "He was your grandmother's husband," Tom said carefully. "He lived on a ranch called Broken Arrow, out in Wyoming where the sky goes on forever." "Was he mean?" The question caught Tom off guard. "I don't know, sweetheart. I thought he was, but maybe I was wrong about a lot of things." Emma looked up with those serious green eyes. "Mama used to say people aren't always what they seem on the outside." Sarah's wisdom, spoken through their daughter's voice. Tom felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever Emma said something that reminded him how much Sarah lived on in her. The lawyer's office in downtown Denver felt like foreign territory. Harrison, Associates, specialized in estate planning for people with more money than Tom had ever imagined. The secretary's shoes probably cost more than his truck payment, but Daniel Callahan, drunk or not, had retained the services of James Harrison III to handle his final affairs. Harrison was younger than Tom expected, maybe 40, with the kind of clean-shaven confidence that came from never having to choose between groceries and rent. He spread documents across his mahogany desk with practiced efficiency. "Your father's estate is relatively straightforward, Mr. Callahan," Harrison said. "The ranch consists of approximately 800 acres in Sweetwater County, Wyoming. Mineral rights included. There's an existing mortgage with First National of Rock Springs, currently about 18 months behind." Tom studied the survey maps and property photographs. The house looked like it hadn't seen paint since the Carter administration. Outbuildings leaned at angles that defied physics. Broken fence posts stretched toward mountains that looked impossibly distant. "What's it worth?" Tom asked. Harrison's pause said everything. "The land has potential, good water rights, decent soil for grazing, but it would need considerable investment to become operational." "How considerable?" "More than most people have, Mr. Callahan. I'll be honest, 3 other potential heirs declined the inheritance once they saw the financial obligations." Tom stared at the photographs. This was his inheritance debt and desolation wrapped in legal documents. But it was also 800 acres of possibility, and more importantly, it was somewhere Emma could grow up without him worrying about rent increases and neighborhood safety. "There's one more thing," Harrison said, pulling out a sealed envelope. "Your father left specific instructions that you were to receive this only if you decided to keep the property." Tom recognized the handwriting, the same careful script from all those unopened letters. His name was written across the front in fading ink, and something rattled inside when he picked it up. "What if I decide not to keep it?" "Then it gets returned to me, unopened, and the property goes to auction." Tom slipped the envelope into his jacket pocket without opening it. Some decisions required the right moment, and a lawyer's office didn't feel like the place to read his father's final words. The drive back to the apartment gave him time to think. 800 acres, mineral rights, a mortgage that was underwater but manageable if he could find work. Emma deserved better than a cramped apartment where she had to whisper after 9 o'clock so the neighbors wouldn't complain. That evening, Tom spread the ranch photographs across their small kitchen table while Emma did homework. She studied the pictures with the intense focus she brought to everything, tracing the fence lines with her finger. "It looks lonely," she said finally. "Yeah, it does. But not scary lonely, more like waiting lonely, like it's waiting for us to make it better." Tom looked at his daughter, really looked at her. 8 years old, and she could see hope in a photograph that looked like failure to everyone else. Maybe that was Sarah's gift living on, or maybe Emma just had the kind of optimism that hadn't been beaten down by years of compromising dreams. "What do you think, Em? Should we take a chance on Grandpa's ranch?" Emma picked up the photograph of the house, studying it with serious consideration. "Mama always said home isn't a place, it's the people you love. As long as we're together, we can make anywhere home." Tom felt Sarah's presence in those words, her voice echoing through their daughter's wisdom. Maybe Daniel Callahan had made mistakes, maybe the ranch was a financial disaster, but it was also a chance. A chance to give Emma something more than rented walls and neighbors who complained about children laughing. That night, after Emma fell asleep, Tom finally opened his father's envelope. Inside was a small brass key and a note written in that familiar, careful script. "Tommy, if you're reading this, you decided to take a chance on the old place. Good. It's got more potential than it looks, and you've got more of me in you than either of us wanted to admit. The key opens the desk in my bedroom. Inside you'll find things that might help you understand why I left and why I stayed away. I wasn't much of a father, but I tried to be a good guardian of something important. Take care of Emma. She deserves the childhood I couldn't give you. Daniel. Tom held the key up to the lamplight, feeling its weight in his palm. His father's final mystery, waiting in a desk 800 miles away. Whatever Daniel Callahan had been protecting all these years, Tom was about to inherit it, along with 800 acres of possibility and debt. 2 weeks later, Tom loaded everything they owned into a rented trailer and pointed his truck toward Wyoming. In the passenger seat, Emma clutched a road atlas, tracking their progress with the excitement of a child who saw adventure where adults saw uncertainty. In his pocket, Daniel's brass key waited alongside the questions Tom had carried for 15 years. The last thing he saw in his rearview mirror was the Denver skyline fading into morning haze. Ahead lay mountains, open sky, and a ranch that might destroy them or save them. Tom couldn't tell which yet, but for the first time since Sarah died, he felt like they were driving towards something instead of just running away. The Wyoming wind hit Tom's face like a slap when he stepped out of the truck at Broken Arrow Ranch. 8 hours of driving through increasingly empty landscape had brought them to this collection of weathered buildings scattered across rolling prairie like dice thrown by a careless hand. The house squatted under the enormous sky, its grey siding bleached by decades of sun and storm. Emma climbed down from the passenger seat, her sneakers crunching on gravel mixed with tumbleweeds. She stood perfectly still for a moment, absorbing the silence that stretched from horizon to horizon, broken only by the whisper of wind through broken fence wire. "It's so quiet," she said, wonder replacing the excitement that had carried her through Colorado. Tom pulled the original deed and survey maps from his jacket, documents the lawyer had insisted he bring. The papers felt substantial in his hands, heavy with legal language that made 800 acres of prairie his responsibility. According to the survey, the property stretched further than the eye could see, encompassing not just the buildings but grazing land that rolled toward distant mountains. "Daddy, look." Emma pointed toward the house where a woman emerged from the front door. She was maybe 60, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and the kind of weathered hands that spoke of a lifetime spent outdoors. She approached them with the measured pace of someone comfortable with wide spaces and long silences. "You must be Tom," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Martha Hayes. I run the Historical Society in town, and I knew your father." Tom shook her hand, surprised by her firm grip. "I wasn't expecting anyone. Your father asked me to keep an eye on the place. I've been doing basic maintenance, making sure the pipes didn't freeze." Martha's eyes moved to Emma, who had wandered toward a broken porch swing. "You must be Emma. Your grandfather talked about you." Emma looked up sharply. "He did?" "He had pictures," Martha said gently. "School photos your father sent, though I don't think Tom knew Daniel kept them." Tom felt something shift in his chest. His father had kept Emma's pictures. All those years of silence, and Daniel had been following his granddaughter's life from a distance. "I should warn you," Martha continued, "the town's been talking since word got out about the inheritance. Not all of it friendly." As if summoned by her words, a dust cloud appeared on the dirt road leading to the ranch. A newer pickup truck approached, pulling up beside Tom's vehicle. The man who emerged was maybe 50, wearing pressed jeans and a spotless cowboy hat that had never seen actual ranch work. "You must be Callahan," the man said, not offering his hand. "Jake Morrison, I own the spread next door." He gestured toward a pristine ranch house visible in the distance. "I'll cut right to the chase. I'm prepared to offer you fair market value for this place. Cash deal, quick closing." Tom studied Morrison's face, noting the practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I just got here, and you can see what you're dealing with. This place has been bleeding money for 20 years. Your old man couldn't make it work, and he actually knew something about ranching." Morrison's gaze swept the broken buildings with theatrical dismay. "No offense, but you're a city mechanic with a little girl to support. This land will eat you alive." Emma had drifted closer during the conversation, her small hand finding Tom's. She studied Morrison with the intense focus she brought to homework problems. "What's fair market value?" Tom asked. Morrison's smile widened. 80,000. More than generous, considering the debt and condition. Martha Hayes made a small sound that might have been disapproval. Morrison's eyes flicked toward her with obvious irritation. "That's less than $100 an acre," Martha said quietly. "For land that can't support cattle and buildings that should be condemned," Morrison replied. His tone remained friendly, but something harder emerged underneath. "Look, Callahan, I'm doing you a favor. Take the money and go back to Denver before you lose everything." Tom felt Emma's hand tighten in his. She was watching Morrison with the wariness of a child who'd learned to read adult moods for her own protection. "I appreciate the offer," Tom said, "but I think I'll look around first." Morrison's smile finally faltered. "Your choice, but don't say I didn't warn you." He climbed back into his truck, pausing before he closed the door. "This country doesn't forgive mistakes, Callahan, especially ones made by outsiders." The dust from Morrison's departure settled slowly in the still air. Martha watched the truck disappear with visible relief. "Jake Morrison's been trying to buy this land for years," she said. "Your father refused every offer." "Why?" Martha hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal. Daniel was complicated. The town remembers him as a drunk who let his ranch fall apart, but there was more to him than that. He had his reasons for staying, even when staying was hard. Tom pulled out the brass key his father had left him. He mentioned a desk in his bedroom. "I'll show you," Martha said. The inside of the house smelled like dust and loneliness. Sheets covered most of the furniture, and family photographs lined the mantelpiece, pictures Tom didn't remember posing for, images of Emma at various ages, even a wedding photo of Tom and Sarah that he didn't know his father possessed. Daniel's bedroom was spartanly furnished. A single bed with military precision corners, a dresser with nothing on top, and an old oak desk positioned near the window. The brass key fit perfectly into the center drawer. Inside, Tom found more photographs, but these were different. Black and white images of Daniel in military uniform, standing beside men in suits near what looked like a government facility. Official documents with letterheads Tom didn't recognize, and beneath it all, a leather journal filled with his father's careful handwriting. Emma climbed onto the bed, studying a photograph of Daniel in uniform. "Grandpa was a soldier?" "Looks like it," Tom said, flipping through the journal. The entries were brief, often cryptic, but they painted a picture of a man involved in something significant during the Cold War years. Martha appeared in the doorway, her expression carefully neutral. "Your father served in the military before you were born. He didn't talk about it much." Tom read a journal entry dated 1963. "Package secured as ordered. Morrison Sr. confirmed coordinates. Operation Cornerstone proceeding as scheduled." "Martha," Tom said slowly, "what do you know about Operation Cornerstone?" Her face went pale. "Where did you hear that name?" "It's in my father's journal, along with the name Morrison." Martha sat heavily in the room's single chair. "I think we need to have a longer conversation about your father, Tom, but not here and not now." Through the bedroom window, Tom could see Emma exploring the barn, her small figure dwarfed by the massive structure. The building leaned significantly to one side, its red paint long since faded to rust brown. "The barn's not safe," Martha said, following his gaze. "Daniel always meant to tear it down." But Emma was already inside, her voice echoing in the empty space. Tom hurried outside, Martha following. "Emma, come out of there." "Dad, look at this." Emma's voice carried excitement instead of fear. Tom found her in the back corner of the barn, kneeling beside what looked like a patch of disturbed earth. The dirt was a different color here, darker and more compact than the surrounding area. "Something's buried here," Emma said with 8-year-old certainty. "The ground feels different." Tom knelt beside his daughter, pressing his hands against the earth. She was right. The soil had been disturbed, filled in, and settled over time. It formed a rough rectangle about 6 feet by 4 feet. Martha approached cautiously. Daniel spent a lot of time in this barn, especially the last few years. I always assumed he was drinking, but he never let anyone inside. Tom looked at the journal in his hands, then at the disturbed earth beneath the barn. His father's final letter had promised answers, but it seemed Daniel Callahan had left behind more questions than solutions. "Emma," Tom said quietly, "I think we're going to need a shovel." Tom found a rusty shovel propped against the barn wall, its wooden handle smooth from years of use. As he began to dig where Emma had indicated, the blade struck something solid within inches of the surface. Not wood or stone, something metallic that rang with hollow authority. "What is it, Daddy?" Emma asked, crouching beside the growing hole. Martha Hayes moved closer, her face tense with curiosity and something that looked like concern. "Daniel always said this barn had good bones. I never understood what he meant." Tom cleared more dirt, revealing the corner of what appeared to be a steel hatch. A military compass lay beside it in the earth, its brass surface tarnished, but intact. Engraved around the rim were coordinates that Tom didn't recognize, numbers that seemed to reference a location far from Wyoming. "That's his compass," Martha said softly. "Daniel carried it everywhere during his last years. I thought it was just sentiment." Tom picked up the compass, feeling its weight in his palm. The needle pointed true north, but the engraved coordinates puzzled him. They didn't match any local landmarks he could think of, and the precision suggested they marked something specific and important. "We should probably stop here for today," Martha said, glancing toward the road. "People talk in small towns, and Jake Morrison has friends." Tom reluctantly agreed, covering the hatch with an old tarp and Emma's promise to keep their discovery secret. That evening, he enrolled Emma in Sweetwater Elementary while she explored the ranch house, her child's adaptability already turning the strange into familiar. The school principal, Mrs. Rodriguez, was kind but direct. "Emma will do fine academically," she said after reviewing Emma's Denver records. "But small towns can be hard on outsiders, especially when there's family history involved." "What kind of history?" "Your father had a reputation, Mr. Callahan. Fair or not, some of that might follow Emma until people get to know her." Tom watched Emma through the office window as she played alone on the playground, her natural friendliness meeting with cautious responses from the other children. It broke his heart to see her experiencing the same rejection he'd felt as a teenager whenever his father's drinking became town gossip. The next morning brought Jake Morrison to their front door again, this time with a man Tom didn't recognize. Expensive suit, city haircut, the kind of smooth confidence that came with serious money. "Tom Callahan? I'm Richard Sterling, Morrison Development. I understand Jake made you an offer on this property." Tom stepped onto the porch, leaving Emma inside with her cereal. "He did. I'm prepared to double it. 160,000. Cash, quick closing." Sterling's smile was practiced perfection. "I represent investors interested in developing this area. Ranch land, recreational opportunities, that sort of thing." The offer was more money than Tom had ever imagined, having enough to set Emma up for college and give them both security. But something in Sterling's eagerness reminded him of Morrison's press-too-hard friendliness. "That's generous," Tom said carefully, "but I'm not ready to sell." Sterling's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Callahan, I've done my research on this property. The debt load alone makes it a poor investment, and you have a young daughter to consider. Take the money and start fresh somewhere with better opportunities." "I appreciate the concern about my daughter," Tom replied, his voice cooling, "but we're staying." After they left, Tom found himself studying his father's military compass again. The engraved coordinates nagged at him. Why would Daniel carry coordinates for a place that didn't seem to exist locally? And why had Morrison's father's name appeared in Daniel's Cold War journal? That afternoon, while Emma did homework at the kitchen table, Tom attempted basic repairs on the ranch house. The plumbing worked but groaned with age. The electrical system was a decade past replacement, and every window needed new putty and paint. But the structure was solid good bones, as Martha had said about the barn. Emma looked up from her math problems. "Dad, why don't people like us here?" The question hit Tom harder than he'd expected. It's not that they don't like us, sweetheart. They just don't know us yet. But they knew Grandpa, and they didn't like him either. Tom sat beside his daughter, choosing his words carefully. Sometimes people make up their minds about someone based on stories they've heard. It takes time to show them who you really are. Was Grandpa really a bad person? Tom looked at the compass sitting on the table, then at the photographs of Daniel in military uniform. I'm starting to think maybe I was wrong about him. Maybe we all were. That evening, Martha Hayes returned with a casserole and information. She'd been researching Daniel's military service, calling in favors with historian friends and government contacts. Your father's records are mostly classified, she said as they sat at the kitchen table. But I found references to Operation Cornerstone. It was a Cold War program, something about securing strategic assets during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Tom showed her the compass coordinates. Any idea what these reference? Martha studied the numbers, frowning. They're not local, that's certain, but they're too precise to be random. She paused, meeting his eyes. Tom, I think your father was involved in something much bigger than anyone realized, and I think Jake Morrison's family knows what it was. What makes you say that? Because Jake's grandfather, Samuel Morrison, owned the land adjacent to this ranch during the 1960s. According to county records, he sold a significant portion to the government in 1962, then bought it back 2 years later for a fraction of the price. Tom felt pieces of a puzzle clicking together. What kind of government sale? The kind that doesn't show up in normal property records. The kind that gets buried in classified files and forgotten histories. That night, after Emma fell asleep, Tom sat on the porch steps with his father's compass, watching stars emerge in the Wyoming darkness. The silence was complete except for wind through grass and the distant call of a coyote. In Denver, such quiet would have felt empty, but here it felt full of possibilities and secrets. The compass needle held steady, pointing north toward mountains, invisible in the darkness. But Tom found himself wondering what lay at those engraved coordinates and why his father had carried the location with him until the day he died. Inside the house, Emma slept peacefully in her new bedroom, surrounded by boxes of belongings and dreams of horses. She'd adapted to the ranch with the resilience of childhood, finding magic where adults saw only challenges. Tom made a decision under the star-filled sky. Whatever his father had protected all these years, whatever secret lay buried beneath the barn, he would uncover the truth. Not just for Emma's inheritance, but for Daniel's memory and the questions that had haunted their family for too long. Tomorrow, he would return to the barn and discover what Daniel Callahan had been guarding in his years of apparent defeat. Emma discovered the radio equipment on a rainy Saturday morning while Tom replaced rotted floorboards in the kitchen. Her excited voice echoed from the farmhouse attic, followed by the sound of something heavy being dragged across wooden planks. "Dad, you need to see this." Tom climbed the narrow stairs to find Emma surrounded by Cold War-era radio equipment, massive vacuum tube receivers, transmitters with military designation numbers, and coils of wire that suggested serious communication capability. Everything was meticulously maintained, protected by canvas covers and positioned as if Daniel had been using it recently. "It still works," Emma said, pointing to green lights glowing on several units. "I think Grandpa was talking to people." Tom examined the equipment with growing amazement. This wasn't surplus store. Junk, these were professional military radios that would have cost more than most people's annual salary. One unit bore a brass plate reading "Property of U.S. Army Signal Corps," while another had been modified with civilian components in ways that suggested serious expertise. "Emma, don't touch anything else," Tom said, but his daughter had already discovered a logbook beside the main receiver. The entries were in Daniel's handwriting, dating back 15 years. Most were brief notations of times and frequencies, but some included cryptic messages. "Package status confirmed. Asset location secure. Waiting for extraction authorization." Tom felt a chill that had nothing to do with the attic's temperature. His father hadn't been the isolated drunk the town remembered. He'd been maintaining contact with someone, reporting on something, for years after whatever operation had originally brought him to Wyoming. A frequency scanner sat beside the main radio, its display cycling through local emergency channels. Tom realized Daniel had been monitoring all official communications in the county police, fire, emergency services. He'd known everything happening in the area, probably including every visitor to the Broken Arrow Ranch. That afternoon, while Emma played in the house, Tom worked alone in the barn, carefully excavating around the steel hatch. The opening was larger than he'd initially thought, and older. Military hardware, this substantial, wasn't buried overnight. This had been a major construction project, disguised as ranch work. Martha Hayes arrived as Tom uncovered the full outline of what appeared to be an entrance to an underground facility. Her face went pale when she saw the extent of the excavation. "Tom, this is bigger than we thought," she said. "You need to understand, during the Cold War, the government built secret installations all over the western states. Missile silos, communication bunkers, storage facilities for things they couldn't keep in Washington." "Storage for what?" "Classified materials. Documents too sensitive for normal archives. Gold reserves moved out of Fort Knox during the Cuban Missile Crisis." Martha's voice dropped to a whisper. "Things that needed to disappear if the Soviets ever invaded." Tom studied the hatch mechanism. It was sophisticated beyond anything a rancher would need, with multiple locking systems and what looked like a hermetic seal. This had been built to protect something valuable from both human intrusion and nuclear fallout. Why would they trust my father with something like this? Maybe they didn't have a choice. Maybe Daniel stumbled onto it accidentally, or maybe he was recruited because he already lived here. Martha paused, studying the disturbed earth. Or maybe he volunteered for something that required a man willing to sacrifice his reputation to maintain a cover story. The pieces of Daniel's life began forming a different picture. The drinking that drove away his family might have been performance, a way to ensure no one looked too closely at his activities. The isolation that seemed like failure might have been discipline, the lonely vigil of a man protecting secrets too dangerous to share. That evening, Tom attempted to operate the attic radio equipment, following procedures outlined in Daniel's logbook. Most frequencies produced only static, but on one specific channel, he heard something that made his blood run cold. Voices discussing the Broken Arrow Ranch by name. "Callahan's been digging around the barn. Morrison says the son doesn't know anything. Can't take chances with this much at stake." Tom killed the radio and sat in the darkness, his heart racing. Someone was watching the ranch, monitoring his activities, discussing him as if he were a problem to be solved. The paranoia Daniel had lived with for decades suddenly seemed completely rational. Downstairs, Emma worked on a school report about Wyoming history, using books Martha had brought from the library. Her teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, had been encouraging, but Emma's classmates remained distant. The town's judgment of Daniel Callahan extended to his granddaughter, 8-year-old prejudice learned from adult conversations. "Dad," Emma said when Tom joined her at the kitchen table, "Mrs. Hayes brought me a book about the Cold War. Did you know the government built secret places all over Wyoming?" Tom forced his voice to remain casual. "Is that right? They hid important things in case of nuclear war, money and documents and stuff like that." Emma looked up from her book with serious green eyes. Maybe Grandpa was helping protect something important. Children's intuition often cut through adult complications with startling accuracy. Emma had spent less than a week at the ranch and already understood something the town had missed for decades. That night, after Emma fell asleep, Tom returned to the barn with a stronger flashlight and proper excavation tools. The hatch wouldn't budge. Despite his best efforts, it required either a key he didn't have or knowledge of a combination that had died with Daniel. But around the edges of the steel frame, Tom found evidence that confirmed his growing suspicions. Concrete poured with government precision, drainage systems that suggested professional construction, and ventilation pipes that indicated something substantial lay beneath the ranch. His father hadn't inherited a failing ranch and drunk himself into isolation. Daniel Callahan had been a guardian, standing watch over something valuable enough to justify a lifetime of sacrifice. The town's mockery, his family's abandonment, the slow deterioration of his public reputational, acceptable losses to maintain a cover story that kept secret government assets safe. Tom sat in the darkness of the barn, surrounded by evidence of his father's hidden heroism. Daniel had let his son believe the worst about him, rather than risk exposing the truth. He died alone and scorned, taking his secrets to the grave to protect something larger than his personal happiness. The weight of that sacrifice settled on Tom's shoulders like a mantle he wasn't sure he was worthy to wear. But Emma deserved to know. Her grandfather had been a man of honor, even if that honor had cost him everything that usually made life worth living. Tomorrow, Tom would find a way to open that hatch and discover what Daniel Callahan had protected with his life's work. Whatever lay beneath the barn was part of Emma's inheritance now, and Tom intended to understand the full scope of what his father had left behind. Tom found Daniel's coded journal while searching through the desk drawers more thoroughly, hidden behind a false back panel that revealed itself only when he pressed against the wood in frustration. The leather-bound book was filled with entries written in a cipher that transformed ordinary letters into meaningless symbols, but the dates told a story of decades-long vigilance. Martha Hayes arrived that Tuesday morning with coffee and the determined expression of someone who'd made a decision overnight. She studied the coded journal with the focused attention of a historian accustomed to puzzles. "This isn't random," she said, tracing the symbols with her finger. "There's a pattern here, a substitution cipher of some kind." During the Cold War, field agents often used book codeciphers based on specific published texts. Tom showed her the radio logs from the attic. He was definitely communicating with someone regularly. "Look at these frequency notations. They're too organized to be random." "Your father was methodical about everything," Martha agreed. "If he created a code, he'd have left himself a way to remember it." They spent the morning examining every book in Daniel's sparse collection, looking for marginalia or markings that might indicate a key text. Emma helped after school, her young eyes catching details the adults missed. "Dad, look at this," Emma said, holding up a worn copy of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. Throughout the book, Daniel had underlined seemingly random letters, but when viewed together, they formed the beginning of a substitution key. Martha's excitement was palpable. He used literature as his cipher base, classic American novels that would be common enough not to draw attention, but specific enough to create a reliable code. Working together, they began decoding the journal entries. The earliest dates back to 1962, describing something called Package Alpha, being relocated from primary site to secondary containment. Later entries referenced regular security checks, communication protocols, and increasingly urgent concerns about unauthorized interest from local assets. "Local assets?" Tom asked. Martha's expression darkened. "That could mean anyone, townspeople, neighboring ranchers, local officials, people who might have figured out something unusual was happening on your father's property." One decoded entry from 1987 sent chills through the room. Morrison Sr. made direct inquiry about eastern pasture activities. Cover story holding, but situation requires monitoring. Grandchild arrival provides additional security concern. Family presence complicates extraction protocols. Tom realized the entry referred to his own birth. His father had been torn between his duty to whatever he was protecting and his desire to have family nearby. The ultimate decision to drive his family away hadn't been weakness or alcoholism, it had been the sacrifice of a man choosing mission over personal happiness. "There's more," Martha said, pointing to entries from the 1990s. "After you left for Denver, Daniel's communications changed. He wasn't just reporting status anymore, he was requesting permission for emergency protocols." The later entries painted a picture of a man, under increasing pressure. References to secondary parties investigating the ranch, equipment failures that threatened package security, and growing concerns that extraction authorization might never come. That afternoon, while Emma played at a neighbor's house, Tom and Martha attempted to decipher Daniel's final entries. The last coded message was dated just 3 months before his death. Package integrity confirmed, security protocols active, awaiting final instructions. If something happens to Guardian, Son has been prepared through inherited materials. Prepared how? Tom asked. Martha pulled out the brass compass they'd found by the hatch. Maybe with this. Those coordinates you couldn't identify, what if they're not for a location, but for something else? A combination maybe, or a reference point for the package location. Tom studied the engraved numbers with new understanding. Instead of latitude and longitude, they might represent layers of security dates, measurements, or coded references that would mean something only to someone who understood the full context. As evening approached, Martha helped Tom explore the radio equipment more thoroughly. Hidden beneath the main console, they discovered additional coded logs and what appeared to be emergency protocols for various scenarios. Daniel had planned for every contingency except the one that actually occurred before he could properly transfer his responsibilities. Tom, Martha said quietly, I think your father was waiting for official word that his mission was complete, permission to reveal the truth, or at least transfer guardianship to proper authorities. When it never came, he had to improvise. The weight of Daniel's situation became clear. A young man recruited for what he'd thought was temporary duty, probably during the Cuban Missile Crisis, who'd found himself the permanent guardian of something too valuable to abandon. Decades had passed, governments had changed, but the secret remained classified, and the guardian remained at his post. That night, after Emma fell asleep, Tom sat in the kitchen studying everything they'd discovered. The coded journal, the radio logs, the compass coordinates, the evidence of underground constructional pieces of a puzzle his father had carried alone for 40 years. A sound outside made him look up. Headlights moved slowly down the ranch road, pausing near the gate before continuing past. Tom killed the kitchen lights and watched from the window as the vehicle made a second pass, this time stopping for several minutes with its engine running. The paranoia Daniel had lived with was becoming Tom's reality. Someone was watching the ranch, evaluating his progress, deciding whether the secrets buried beneath the broken arrow were still safe. Tom thought about Emma sleeping upstairs, trusting him to keep her safe in this new life they'd built. His daughter deserved better than the fear that had consumed her grandfather, but she also deserved the truth about Daniel's heroism and the inheritance that came with it. Tomorrow, he would take the compass coordinates and decoded journal entries back to the barn. Whatever combination or key those numbers represented, whatever his father had protected beneath the Wyoming prairie, Tom was going to open that hatch and finally understand the full scope of Daniel Callahan's sacrifice. The headlights returned a third time, moving even more slowly. Someone was definitely watching, evaluating, planning. Tom realized he might not have much time before external forces decided the secret was too dangerous to leave in civilian hands. He needed to solve his father's final puzzle before others solved it for him. Martha and Tom made their breakthrough Thursday evening, when Martha brought a magnifying glass to examine the government photographs more closely. Hidden behind Daniel's false wall panel, the black and white images showed her grandfather with men in suits standing before what was unmistakably a younger version of the Broken Arrow Ranch. "Look at this," Martha said, pointing to a figure partially obscured by shadow in one photograph. "That's Samuel Morrison, Jake's grandfather. He's not just visiting, he's giving some kind of presentation." The photographs told a story of official government business conducted in secret. Daniel Callahan, in military uniform, stood at attention beside civilian officials, while surveying equipment and construction materials were visible in the background. This hadn't been a simple land acquisition, it had been a major installation project. Your father wasn't recruited randomly, Martha realized. He was already military, probably selected specifically for this assignment. The ranch wasn't his family property, it was his duty station. Tom studied a photograph showing construction equipment near where the barn now stood. The civilian-dressed officials were examining blueprints, while Daniel and another soldier maintained security positions. One man's face was clearly visibly an older Samuel Morrison, directing the operation with obvious authority. So Jake's grandfather was involved from the beginning, Tom said. More than involved, he was in charge. Martha pulled out additional photographs that showed Morrison Sr. shaking hands with government officials. This was his operation, and your father was the security element assigned to protect it. The implications cascaded through Tom's understanding of the town's dynamics. Jake Morrison's hostility wasn't simple land greed, it was generational panic about family secrets being exposed. The Morrison family had been complicit in whatever classified operation had brought Daniel Callahan to Wyoming. That evening, Tom attempted to use the compass coordinates as a combination for the barn hatch's locking mechanism. The numbers engraved on the brass surface 41-7-23-61 could represent dates, measurements, or sequential inputs for a mechanical lock. Working by flashlight, Tom tried various interpretations of the numbers. As longitude and latitude, they pointed to locations in the Atlantic Ocean. As dates, they might reference specific days during the Cold War crisis. But when he tried them as a sequence for the hatch's combination lock, the fourth attempt produced a satisfying click. The steel hatch lifted with surprising ease, revealing a ladder descending into darkness. The engineering was impressive: enforced concrete walls, professional ventilation systems, and electric lighting that activated automatically as Tom descended into what was clearly a government-built fallout shelter. The underground chamber was larger than Tom had imagined. Main room, storage alcoves, communication center, and living quarters that could have sustained several people for months. But it was the contents that took his breath away. Gold bars were stacked along one wall, with military precision, hundreds of them bearing official U.S. Treasury markings. Documents filled filing cabinets with labels like Operation Cornerstone, Emergency Asset Relocation, and Post-Crisis Recovery Protocols. Maps showed similar facilities throughout the western states, all connected by communication networks and supply chains. Tom found himself standing in what amounted to a backup vault for critical government assets relocated during the Cuban Missile Crisis. When nuclear war seemed imminent in 1962, valuable materials had been dispersed to secret locations throughout the country. The Broken Arrow Ranch had been one of those locations. But why had the assets never been retrieved? Tom examined the communication logs and found his answer in a file marked Mission Status Update 1963. The operation had been classified beyond normal levels when political priorities shifted after the crisis ended. Personnel involved had been sworn to secrecy indefinitely, with retrieval authorization dependent on conditions that apparently never materialized. Daniel Callahan had volunteered for what he thought was temporary duty and found himself the permanent guardian of assets worth tens of millions of dollars. The gold alone represented a substantial portion of America's strategic reserves during the Cold War's most dangerous period. Among the documents, Tom found his father's real service record. Daniel hadn't been a simple rancher who deteriorated into alcoholisms. He'd been a decorated intelligence officer selected for the most sensitive possible assignment. His apparent failure in civilian life had been an elaborate cover story to explain his isolation and discourage investigation. The personal cost was documented in Daniel's private notes, stored separately from official communications. Letters he'd written but never sent to his son, explaining the impossible choice between family and duty. Photographs of Tom growing up that Daniel had collected through distant observation. Records of financial support secretly provided through intermediaries during Tom's college years. I couldn't tell you the truth because the truth would have made you a target. One unsent letter read, "Better to let you think I was weak than to put you in danger. Better to be hated than to risk the security of something bigger than both of us." Tom sat in the underground chamber, surrounded by evidence of his father's sacrifice and his own misunderstanding. Daniel had let his family believe the worst about him to protect both them and his mission. The loneliness he'd endured, the reputation he'd accepted, the relationships he'd sacrificed, all necessary costs of guarding secrets that could have changed the course of the Cold War if compromised. Above ground, vehicle engines approached the ranch. Tom quickly photographed key documents with his phone before climbing the ladder and securing the hatch. Through the barn's broken siding, he saw multiple vehicles surrounding the farmhouse: Jake Morrison's truck, Richard Sterling's sedan, and two others he didn't recognize. Emma was inside, doing homework, unaware of the men gathering in their yard. Tom's heart raced as he realized the surveillance had escalated to direct action. Whatever patience these people had shown was apparently exhausted. He slipped through the barn's rear entrance and circled toward the house, staying low and using outbuildings for cover. The radio equipment in the attic suddenly made perfect sense. Daniel would have monitored exactly this type of situation, preparing for the day when external forces decided the secret was too dangerous to leave unguarded. Through the kitchen window, Tom could see Emma at the table, her schoolbooks spread around her like a fortress of normalcy. She looked up as vehicles' doors slammed outside, her expression shifting from curiosity to the wariness that had become too familiar since their arrival in Wyoming. Tom reached the back door as voices rose from the front yard. Jake Morrison was speaking with authority, directing the other men like someone accustomed to command. The family resemblance to his grandfather's photographs was unmistakable, the same cold confidence, the same assumption that others would follow his lead. "Emma," Tom called softly as he entered through the kitchen, "go upstairs to your room and stay there." His daughter looked at him with serious green eyes that missed nothing. "Are those the bad men from your worried voice?" Tom's heart clenched at her perceptive question. "Just some people who want to talk about grown-up things. I'll handle it." Emma gathered her books with the efficiency of a child who'd learned to read adult moods for survival signals. Before heading upstairs, she paused beside her father. "Dad, Grandpa's compass is still on the kitchen counter. Maybe you should put it somewhere safe." Tom pocketed the brass compass, realizing Emma understood more about their situation than he'd given her credit for. 8 years old, and she was already thinking like someone who needed to protect family secrets. The knock on the front door was firm but polite, to the kind of authoritative courtesy that preceded ultimatums. Tom answered to find Jake Morrison flanked by Richard Sterling and two men whose bearings screamed federal authority, despite their civilian clothes. "Tom," Morrison said with false friendliness, "we need to talk. Mind if we come in?" "Actually, I do mind. Emma's doing homework." "This won't take long," Sterling replied, already pushing past Tom into the living room. "We understand you've been doing some exploring around the property. Found anything interesting?" Tom remained by the door, blocking further access to the house. "Just old ranch equipment and my father's personal effects." One of the federal men stepped forward. "Mr. Callahan, I'm Agent Patterson, Department of Homeland Security. We have reason to believe this property contains materials relevant to national security. We'd appreciate your cooperation in resolving this matter quietly." The words carried weight Tom couldn't ignore, but something in Patterson's manner felt wrong. Real federal agents would have arrived with warrants and backup, not skulked around rural properties with local conspirators. "What kind of materials?" Tom asked. Morrison's patience cracked slightly. "The kind that could get people hurt if they're mishandled by civilians who don't understand what they're dealing with." Tom thought about Emma upstairs, about the gold and documents in the underground chamber, about his father's decades of lonely service. Whatever game these men were playing, it wasn't official government business. "I think you should leave," Tom said. Sterling smiled without warmth. "Tom, be reasonable. This property has been nothing but trouble for your family. Take our offer, it's more than generous, and start fresh somewhere else." "With your daughter," Patterson added meaningfully. "Little girls need stability, safe neighborhoods, good schools. Wyoming can be dangerous for people who aren't careful." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Tom felt anger building in his chest, the same protective fury that had driven him through Sarah's illness and Emma's adjustment to life without her mother. "Get off my property," Tom said quietly. Morrison's mask finally slipped entirely. "Your property? Your drunk father couldn't even keep this place together. You think you can do better? My father was a better man than any of you understood. Your father was a security risk who should have been removed years ago," Sterling snapped. "The only reason he wasn't was because certain people believed his cover story was useful." Tom realized they'd revealed more than they intended. These men knew about Daniel's real work, had probably been monitoring the situation for years, waiting for the right moment to claim whatever assets his father had protected. "I'm not selling," Tom said firmly. Patterson reached inside his jacket, but before he could reveal whatever authority he intended to display, Martha Hayes' voice cut through the tension from the driveway. "Gentlemen, I hope you're not harassing my neighbors." Tom had never been happier to see anyone in his life. Martha approached with the confident stride of someone comfortable with confrontation, her historian's mind already cataloguing faces and license plates for future reference. "Mrs. Hayes," Morrison said with obvious displeasure, "this is a private conversation." "On a public road, with raised voices," Martha replied. "I think it's time you all went home." The federal agents, or whoever they actually were, exchanged glances with Morrison. Whatever they'd planned, it hadn't included witnesses, with Martha's credibility in the community. "This isn't over, Callahan," Morrison said as they moved toward their vehicles. "Some decisions can't be put off forever." Tom watched them drive away, his hands shaking with adrenaline and anger. Emma appeared at the top of the stairs, having heard enough to understand their family was in danger. Martha entered the house with the grim expression of someone who'd seen this scenario before. "Tom, I think it's time we talked about getting some help. Real help, from people who can match whatever resources those men represent." Tom pulled the brass compass from his pocket, its familiar weight somehow reassuring. "Martha, what I found today changes everything. My father wasn't just guarding land, he was protecting something worth dying for." That night, after Emma fell asleep, Tom led Martha to the barn by flashlight. The steel hatch opened smoothly now that he understood the combination, revealing the underground chamber that had been Daniel's greatest secret and heaviest burden. Martha descended the ladder in stunned silence, her historian's mind struggling to process the scope of what Daniel had protected for 4 decades. The gold bars gleaming under electric lights, the filing cabinets full of classified documents, the communication equipment still humming with standby power. It was like stepping into a perfectly preserved piece of Cold War history. "My God," Martha whispered, examining official documents bearing presidential seals. "Tom, this isn't just valuable, it's historically priceless. These are the actual emergency protocols for Operation Cornerstone." Tom showed her the files he'd discovered, including his father's real service record and the unsent letters, explaining his impossible situation. But it was the official operation files that revealed the full scope of the conspiracy they now faced. "Look at this," Martha said, holding up a document marked Personnel Assignment, Operation Cornerstone. Among the names listed were Samuel Morrison as Civilian Coordinator and Daniel Callahan as Security Element Commander. But the most shocking revelation came in a file marked Post-Crisis Asset Management. According to the documents, Operation Cornerstone had officially ended in 1964, with all assets supposedly returned to federal custody. The gold, documents, and equipment in the underground chamber should not have existed. This means the official records were falsified, Martha realized. Someone reported the assets as recovered when they were actually left here under Daniel's protection. Tom found the smoking gun in a file labeled Financial Reconciliation, 1964. Samuel Morrison had signed documents certifying the complete removal of all classified materials from the Wyoming location, receiving substantial compensation for his cooperation in the operation's closure. But the assets had never been moved. Morrison's grandfather stole $50 million in government gold and blamed my father for its disappearance, Tom said, the pieces finally clicking together. That's why Daniel could never reveal the truth. He was protecting the government's assets from the man officially responsible for their return. Martha examined additional documents that painted a picture of systematic deception. Samuel Morrison had reported equipment failures and security compromises that never actually occurred, creating justification for emergency asset relocation that had never happened. He'd collected payment for services never rendered, while Daniel maintained actual security for assets officially listed as returned. Your father wasn't just a guardian, Martha said quietly. He was the only thing standing between $50 million in government gold and the family that had already stolen it once. The weight of Daniel's sacrifice became clear. He'd accepted a lifetime of isolation and family rejection to prevent the Morrison family from completing their theft. Every year of apparent failure had been another year of successful mission completion, protecting assets that didn't officially exist from people who couldn't officially be stopped. But the documents revealed something even more disturbing. Recent correspondence, dating from just months before Daniel's death, showed that Jake Morrison had been pressuring federal contacts to declare the site officially closed and seal all records. Without Daniel's protection, the Morrison family was positioned to finally claim the assets they'd attempted to steal 40 years earlier. That's why Jake was so eager to buy the ranch, Tom realized. He knew what was buried here, and with my father dead, he thought he could finally complete what his grandfather started. Martha found evidence that Jake Morrison had been working with Richard Sterling's development company to create legitimate-looking land acquisition that would give them access to the underground chamber. The federal agents who'd visited that afternoon were probably private contractors hired to provide official-seeming pressure. Tom, this goes beyond simple greed, Martha said, examining communication logs. The Morrison family has been planning this for decades, waiting for Daniel to die so they could claim rightful inheritance to something they never owned. Among Daniel's personal files, Tom found his father's contingency plans. If the official guardianship ever ended, Daniel had prepared detailed evidence packages to be delivered to multiple federal agencies, news organizations, and congressional oversight committees. He'd spent 40 years documenting the Morrison family's crimes while maintaining his cover as a failed rancher. He was building a case, Tom said, reading his father's methodical notes. Every conversation with Jake, every pressure tactic, every attempt to force him off the land, Daniel recorded everything. The final revelation came in Daniel's last will and testament, filed separately from the estate documents Tom had received. In this version, Daniel explicitly transferred not just the ranch property, but all associated federal assets and security responsibilities to his son, along with detailed instructions for contacting legitimate government authorities. Your father made you the legal guardian of classified government property, Martha said. That's why Jake Morrison can't just take the land by force. The federal assets belong to you now, and stealing them would be treason. Tom understood why his father had maintained the charade until his death. As long as Daniel appeared to be a harmless drunk on worthless land, the Morrison family had been content to wait. But Tom's arrival and obvious competence had accelerated their timeline, forcing them to act before he could discover the truth. The radio equipment suddenly crackled to life with an incoming transmission on Daniel's emergency frequency. Tom and Martha froze as a voice emerged from the static knot, the local surveillance they'd been monitoring, but something far more official. Broken Arrow Base, this is Overwatch Command. Respond immediately. We show anomalous activity at your location. Tom stared at the radio, realizing that somewhere in the federal government, Daniel's 40-year mission was still being monitored. The real authorities knew about the underground chamber, the protected assets, and possibly the Morrison family's attempts to claim them. Martha grabbed the microphone with historian's boldness. Overwatch Command, this is Martha Hayes speaking for new Site Commander Tom Callahan. Daniel Callahan died 3 months ago, and his son has inherited guardianship responsibilities. A long pause. Then, confirm your identity, Mrs. Hayes. We show you as Daniel Callahan's designated emergency contact. Confirmed. Tom Callahan is Daniel's son and legal heir. We have evidence of unauthorized attempts to access classified materials by local parties. Understood. Federal assets will be securing your location within the hour. Maintain current position and allow no access to restricted areas. Tom felt something lifting from his shoulders, a burden he'd inherited without understanding, now being transferred to people who could handle it properly. His father's long vigil was finally ending with the arrival of legitimate federal authority. But through the barn's broken siding, Tom could see lights moving across the ranch property. Jake Morrison and his allies weren't waiting for federal intervention. They were making their final attempt to claim the assets before official help could arrive. "Martha," Tom said urgently, "we need to get back to Emma." They secured the underground chamber and ran toward the farmhouse, where Tom could see shadows moving around the building. Jake Morrison had brought more men this time, and they were no longer bothering with legal pretense. The brass compass in Tom's pocket seemed to pulse with the weight of his father's legacy. Daniel Callahan had spent 40 years protecting government assets from thieves who wore the mask of respectability. Now Tom faced the same choice: protect what his father had died guarding, or let the Morrison family finally complete their decades-old theft. Above them, Emma's bedroom light was still on. His daughter was awake, probably listening to the sounds of men surrounding their home. Tom thought about Daniel's sacrifice, about the price of duty, about the inheritance that came with choosing principle over personal safety. He was no longer just a widowed mechanic trying to build a new life for his daughter. He was the guardian of secrets worth dying for, facing the same impossible choice that had defined his father's life. The difference was that this time, help was coming. Tom and Martha reached the farmhouse to find Jake Morrison's men positioned around the property with military precision. These weren't local ranch hands. They moved with the coordinated efficiency of professionals, using night vision equipment and communication devices that suggested serious financial backing. Emma met them at the back door, her face pale but determined. "Dad, I called Mrs. Rodriguez like you taught me to do if strangers came to the house. She's calling the sheriff." Tom hugged his daughter, amazed by her presence of mind under pressure. Sarah's strength lived on in Emma's courage, the same quiet bravery that had carried his wife through her final battle with cancer. "Good thinking, sweetheart. Now I need you to go to your room and stay away from the windows until this is over." "Are they here for Grandpa's secret?" Tom looked into his daughter's serious green eyes, realizing she'd understood far more than he'd given her credit for. 8 years old, and she'd already figured out that their family was guarding something important. "Yes, Em. They want something that belongs to our family, something Grandpa spent his whole life protecting." Emma nodded with the gravity of someone much older. "Then we can't let them have it." Martha was monitoring the radio equipment Tom had brought up from the underground chamber, coordinating with the federal response team while tracking Jake Morrison's communications. The official help was still 20 minutes away, but Morrison's men were moving into final positions around the house. "Tom, they're not planning to negotiate," Martha said grimly. "I'm hearing orders about securing the package and eliminating complications. They know federal authorities are coming." Through the kitchen window, Tom could see Jake Morrison himself approaching the front door, flanked by Richard Sterling and 2 men whose tactical gear left no doubt about their intentions. This was the Morrison family's final play claim, the assets by force, before legitimate government authority could intervene. Tom made a decision that would have made his father proud. He activated the emergency beacon Daniel had hidden in the radio equipment, broadcasting a distress signal on frequencies monitored by multiple federal agencies. If the Morrison family wanted to steal government gold, they'd have to do it with official witnesses. The knock on the front door was sharp and demanding. Tom answered to find Jake Morrison holding official-looking documents, his usual false friendliness replaced by cold determination. "Tom, these are federal seizure orders for this property. You have 30 minutes to evacuate before we begin asset recovery operations." Tom examined the papers, noting discrepancies that confirmed his suspicions. "These documents are fake, Jake. The letterhead's wrong. The seal's a photocopy, and the signature doesn't match federal format. Morrison's mask finally dropped completely. It doesn't matter what you think you know, Callahan. By morning, this property will be under federal control and you'll be another sad story about a city boy who couldn't handle ranch life. Except federal authorities are already en route, Martha said from behind Tom. Real federal authorities who know the difference between legitimate asset recovery and organized theft. Sterling stepped forward with obvious menace. Mrs. Hayes, you're interfering with national security operations. That could be considered treason. What could be considered treason, Martha replied sharply, is a 40-year conspiracy to steal classified government property while filing false reports with federal agencies. Tom realized they were buying time, keeping the Morrison group talking until help arrived. But Emma was upstairs, and the men surrounding the house weren't going to wait for official intervention. Jake, Tom said quietly, your grandfather tried to steal $50 million in government gold and blame my father for its disappearance. Daniel spent 40 years protecting those assets from your family's theft. I have the original Operation Cornerstone files that prove everything. Morrison's face went white, then flushed with anger. Your father was a drunk who couldn't handle his responsibilities. The assets were officially transferred in 1964 to your grandfather, who reported them as returned to federal custody while actually leaving them buried on this ranch. I have Samuel Morrison's signed receipts for assets he never moved, payment records for services he never provided, and 40 years of Daniel's documentation proving the gold never left Wyoming. The accusation hung in the air between them, decades of family secrets finally exposed. Jake Morrison had grown up knowing his family's wealth was built on theft, waiting for the day he could complete what his grandfather had started. Even if that were true, Sterling said, you can't prove anything. The official records support our version of events. Actually, I can prove everything, Martha interjected, holding up a file folder, because Daniel Callahan spent 4 decades building a legal case against your family. Every conversation, every pressure tactic, every attempt to force him off this land documented, recorded, and filed with federal oversight agencies. Tom pulled out his father's original service record, the one that showed Daniel as a decorated intelligence officer rather than a failed rancher. My father was a hero who sacrificed his family relationships to protect government assets from thieves. The only reason your family isn't in federal prison is because Daniel chose duty over personal vindication. Morrison's composure cracked completely. He gestured to his men, who began moving closer to the house. None of that matters now. We have the manpower, we have the equipment, and we have a 30-year head start on planning this operation. What you have, said a new voice from the darkness, is about 30 seconds to surrender before federal agents place you under arrest. Tom had never been happier to hear official authority. Floodlights suddenly illuminated the ranch property, revealing FBI tactical teams positioned around Morrison's men. Helicopters circled overhead while armored vehicles blocked all escape routes. Agent Sarah Chen stepped into the light, her badge clearly visible and her authority unquestionable. Jake Morrison, Richard Sterling, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit theft of federal property, filing false documents with government agencies, and attempting to steal classified materials. Morrison made one last desperate attempt. Agent Chen, these people are interfering with legitimate asset recovery operations. We have federal authorization. What you have, Chen replied, are forged documents and a 40-year-old crime that's finally catching up with you. Daniel Callahan was a federal asset guardian, and his son is now the legal custodian of classified materials you've been trying to steal since 1964. Tom watched Jake Morrison's world collapse as federal agents secured the scene. The man who'd grown up believing he was entitled to stolen gold was finally facing the consequences of his family's generational crime. Emma appeared at Tom's side, having watched the entire confrontation from the stairs. She studied Jake Morrison with the same serious attention she brought to difficult homework problems. "Dad," she said quietly, "is Mr. Morrison going to jail?" I think so, sweetheart. He tried to take something that didn't belong to him. Good, Emma said with 8-year-old certainty. Grandpa wouldn't have liked that. Agent Chen approached Tom with the kind of respectful attention given to someone who'd just inherited significant federal responsibilities. Mr. Callahan, we need to discuss the classified assets your father was protecting. The gold and documents will need to be officially transferred, but given your family's service record, there are options we should explore. Tom looked at his daughter, then at Martha Hayes, who'd become more than a neighbor in their weeks of discovery. He thought about Daniel's sacrifice, about the price of duty, about the legacy his father had left them. Agent Chen, I'd like to hear those options, but first, I have some questions about my father's real service record and what kind of man he actually was. He was the kind of man, Chen replied, who spent 40 years protecting his country's assets while letting his family believe he was a failure. There aren't many people with that level of dedication. As federal agents processed the scene and the Morrison family's conspiracy finally faced justice, Tom realized his inheritance was larger than he'd imagined. Not just 800 acres of Wyoming ranchland, not just $50 million in government gold, but the knowledge that Daniel Callahan had been a hero worth emulating. Emma slipped her small hand into his as they watched Jake Morrison being led away in handcuffs. The girl who'd grown up thinking her grandfather was a shameful family secret now knew he'd been a guardian of something precious. The crisis was ending, but Tom's real responsibilities were just beginning. The town meeting Tom called for the following Saturday filled Sweetwater's community center beyond capacity. Word had spread quickly about the federal operation at the Broken Arrow Ranch, and everyone wanted to understand what had really happened to Daniel Callahan and why the Morrison family had been arrested. Tom stood at the front of the room, holding his father's final letter, the one document he'd saved for this moment. Emma sat in the front row beside Martha Hayes, her small face serious with the weight of family truth finally being told. Most of you knew my father as a drunk who let his ranch fall apart. Tom began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed room. I believed that story too for most of my life. I was wrong, and so were all of you. He opened the sealed envelope Daniel had left specifically for this purpose, reading his father's words to the community that had scorned him. If Tom is reading this to the people of Sweetwater, it means the truth can finally be told. I came to Wyoming in 1962 as a military intelligence officer assigned to protect classified government assets during the Cuban Missile Crisis. When the immediate danger passed, I volunteered to remain as guardian of materials too sensitive to move. I let you believe I was weak because weakness was my disguise. I let you believe I was a failure because failure was my protection. I let my family believe I was worthless because their disappointment kept them safe from the truth. For 40 years, I protected $50 million in federal gold and classified documents from people who would have used them to harm our country. I accepted your scorn, your mockery, and your pity because they were the price of keeping America's secrets safe. I was never the man you thought I was. I was the man my country needed me to be. The room fell silent as Tom's voice carried his father's final words. In the back, he could see townspeople who'd whispered cruel jokes about Daniel Callahan, struggling to reconcile their assumptions with this new reality. Jake Morrison's elderly supporters looked uncomfortable, realizing they'd spent decades scorning a war hero while supporting a family of thieves. The revelation that Samuel Morrison had attempted to steal government gold while Daniel protected it reframed 40 years of local history. My father died alone and scorned, Tom continued, protecting assets that belonged to all of us. While Jake Morrison's family built their wealth on attempted theft of federal property, Daniel Callahan stood guard over America's emergency reserves. Emma stood up with the courage her mother had possessed, her clear voice carrying to every corner of the room, "My grandpa was a hero. He protected important things even when it made people think bad things about him. That's what heroes do, they do what's right even when it's hard." The 8-year-old simple truth cut through decades of adult assumptions and prejudice. Tom watched faces change throughout the room as people processed the scope of their misjudgment. Mrs. Rodriguez, Emma's teacher, was the first to stand. "Daniel Callahan deserves our apology and our gratitude. Emma, your grandfather was a better man than any of us realized." Others followed the librarian who'd known Daniel as a young soldier, the mechanic who'd occasionally worked on his truck, neighbors who'd seen him as a failure rather than recognizing his sacrifice. One by one, the community began acknowledging the debt they owed to a man they'd never understood. But not everyone accepted the truth gracefully. Morrison's remaining allies attempted to defend their position, claiming Daniel's story was fabricated to justify Tom's inheritance. "This is all very convenient," said Robert Hayes, Jake's longtime supporter. "A mysterious federal operation that nobody can verify, classified documents that nobody can examine, and a fortune in gold that conveniently makes the Callahan family rich." Tom had prepared for this challenge. He nodded to Agent Chen, who'd agreed to attend the meeting in an official capacity. "Mr. Hayes," Chen said, standing and displaying her federal credentials, "I can verify that Daniel Callahan served with distinction as a guardian of classified federal assets for 4 decades. The operation was real, the gold was real, and the Morrison family's attempt to steal it was real." She continued with the authority that only legitimate federal agents possessed. "The documents and assets Tom Callahan inherited are currently under federal protection, and their existence has been verified by multiple agencies. Daniel Callahan's service record has been declassified specifically to allow this community to understand the truth about his sacrifice." The room stirred as people realized they were hearing official confirmation from federal authority. The wild story of buried gold and secret operations wasn't local legend, it was documented history. Tom felt the mood in the room shifting as his father's reputation transformed from shame to honor. Emma beamed with pride, finally able to hold her head high about her grandfather's legacy. "There's something else," Tom said, ready to make the announcement that would cement Daniel's place in local history. "The federal government has agreed to let me establish a memorial foundation using a portion of the recovered assets. The Daniel Callahan Memorial Fund will provide college scholarships for Wyoming students who demonstrate the same quiet courage my father showed for 40 years. The applause that followed Tom's announcement was spontaneous and sustained. People who had mocked Daniel Callahan for decades were rising to their feet, honoring the memory of a man whose sacrifice they'd never understood. But the moment was interrupted by a commotion near the back of the room. Richard Sterling pushed through the crowd, his face red with anger and desperation. Federal charges had been filed, but he was still free on bond and apparently unwilling to accept defeat. "This is all lies," Sterling shouted. "You people are being manipulated by a clever conman who's stolen federal property and invented a story to justify it." Agent Chen moved to intercede, but Tom held up his hand. Some confrontations needed to happen in public, with witnesses, so the truth could be established beyond doubt. "Mr. Sterling," Tom said calmly, "would you like to see the original government contract that proves my father's assignment?" From his jacket, Tom produced the document he'd brought specifically for this moment, the official Operation Cornerstone assignment orders, bearing Daniel Callahan's name, federal seals, and authentication stamps that couldn't be forged. Sterling examined the papers with growing desperation, realizing they were genuine federal documents that destroyed his family's version of events. The Morrison-Sterling partnership had been built on lies that were now exposed in front of the entire community. "Even if this is real," Sterling said, his voice cracking, "it doesn't change anything. The assets were officially transferred in 1964. We have the paperwork." Martha Hayes stood with the confidence of a historian who'd spent weeks researching the truth. "What you have, Mr. Sterling, are forged documents created by Samuel Morrison to cover up his attempted theft. The real transfer orders were never signed because the assets were never moved." She produced copies of the authentic federal records, showing the discrepancies between Morrison's fraudulent reports and the actual government files. The evidence was overwhelming: 40 years of systematic deception exposed by careful historical research. Emma rose again, her young voice cutting through the adult complications with startling clarity. "Mr. Sterling, why are you so angry about my grandpa being a hero? Shouldn't you be happy that someone protected important things for our country?" The question, asked with 8-year-old innocence, revealed the moral bankruptcy at the heart of Sterling's position. He was angry not because Daniel's story was false, but because its truth exposed his own family's criminality. "Little girl," Sterling said with barely controlled rage, "you don't understand the complexities of adult business." "I understand right and wrong," Emma replied with her mother's quiet strength. "Grandpa did what was right, even when it was hard. You're trying to take things that don't belong to you. That's wrong." The community watched this exchange, with growing clarity about who deserved their support. A decorated war hero who'd sacrificed everything for duty, or the families who'd built their wealth on attempted theft of federal assets. Agent Chen finally intervened with federal authority. "Mr. Sterling, you're under federal indictment and approaching a minor in a threatening manner. I strongly suggest you leave immediately." But Sterling's composure had completely cracked. Years of planning, decades of assumed entitlement, and generational wealth built on criminal conspiracy were collapsing around him. "You people don't understand what you're destroying," he screamed. "The Morrison family built this town. We provided jobs, investment, community leadership for 3 generations. Built on stolen federal gold," Martha said quietly. "Leadership based on criminal conspiracy. Investment using money that belonged to the American people." Tom stepped forward with the calm authority he'd inherited from his father. "Mr. Sterling, your partnership with Jake Morrison is over. The assets you tried to steal are being returned to federal custody, and the community you tried to manipulate now knows the truth." "This isn't finished," Sterling said, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "You think you've won, but there are consequences to destroying established families. Accidents happen to people who interfere with serious business." The threat was clear and witnessed by the entire room. Agent Chen immediately moved to arrest Sterling for threatening a federal witness, but Tom held up his hand again. "Mr. Sterling," Tom said with Daniel's quiet courage, "my father faced much more dangerous people than you for 40 years and never backed down. I inherited his responsibilities and his resolve. Threatening my family was a mistake." Emma moved to stand beside her father, her small hand finding his with the same trust she'd always shown. Martha Hayes joined them, creating a visual representation of the alliance that had uncovered the truth. The community saw 3 popular working father, his brave daughter, and a dedicated historian standing against wealth and corruption with nothing but truth and courage. The moral choice was clear. Sheriff Williams, who'd been listening from the doorway, finally acted with the authority Sterling's federal charges demanded. "Richard Sterling, you're under arrest for threatening federal witnesses and interfering with a federal investigation." As Sterling was led away in handcuffs, joining Jake Morrison in federal custody, the room erupted in genuine applause. Not polite community theater, but real appreciation for justice finally being served. Tom looked out at faces that had changed from suspicion to respect, from skepticism to support. Daniel Callahan's reputation was finally restored, and Emma could grow up proud of her grandfather's heroism. The climax was over, but the healing was just beginning. 6 months later, Tom stood in the same barn where Emma had first noticed the disturbed earth that changed their lives forever. But everything was different now. Fresh paint covered weathered siding, new equipment filled the workspace, and through the open doors, he could see Emma playing with friends from schoolchildren who now competed for invitations to visit the famous Broken Arrow Ranch. The underground chamber had been officially sealed after federal agents completed their asset recovery, but not before Tom had photographed everything for the historical record. The Daniel Callahan Memorial Museum, housed in the renovated farmhouse, now displayed selected documents and artifacts that told the story of one man's 40-year vigil protecting America's secrets. Martha Hayes approached from the house, carrying a framed photograph that would complete the museum's main exhibit. It showed Tom, Emma, and Martha at the ranch's dedication ceremony, flanked by federal officials who'd finally acknowledged Daniel's service. But more importantly, it captured 3 people who'd become a family through shared discovery and mutual respect. "The new display looks perfect," Martha said, admiring the museum setup. "Emma did a wonderful job writing the description of her grandfather's compass." Tom smiled, thinking about his daughter's simple but powerful words. "This compass helped my grandpa find his way through hard times. It helped him remember that some directions are worth following, even when they're difficult." The brass compass now rested in a place of honor, its engraved coordinates finally understood as the combination that had protected $50 million in government assets. But for Emma, it had become something more, a symbol of the courage required to do what's right, regardless of personal cost. "Any regrets about not keeping more of the gold?" Martha asked with gentle teasing. Tom looked out at the thriving ranch, the happy children, the community that had embraced them after learning the truth. The federal government had been generous in their settlement, providing enough compensation to secure Emma's future while ensuring the ranch could operate as both a working farm and historical site. "Not for a minute," Tom said honestly. "Dad protected that gold because it belonged to the American people. Keeping it would have made us rich, but returning it made us part of something bigger." The Daniel Callahan Memorial Scholarship Fund had already awarded its first grants to Wyoming students, demonstrating academic excellence and moral courage. Emma took special pride in reading the applications, looking for young people who reminded her of her grandfather's quiet heroism. Jake Morrison and Richard Sterling had been sentenced to federal prison for their decades-long conspiracy to steal government assets. Their family's wealth, built on attempted theft, was being systematically returned to federal custody. The Morrison ranch would be sold at auction, its proceeds used to compensate taxpayers for 40 years of criminal conspiracy. Speaking of the memorial fund, Martha said, "We received another application that I think Emma will love. A young man from Cheyenne who wants to study military history and preserve stories like your father's." Tom felt the satisfaction that came from seeing Daniel's sacrifice inspire the next generation. His father's reputation had been completely restored, but more importantly, his example was motivating young people to choose service over self-interest. Emma ran toward them with the boundless energy of a child who'd found her place in the world. At 9 years old, she moved through Sweetwater with the confidence of someone who belonged, whose family history was a source of pride rather than shame. "Dad, Mrs. Rodriguez wants to know if we can bring Grandpa's radio equipment to school for the Cold War presentation." Tom laughed at his daughter's enthusiasm. The same equipment Daniel had used to maintain contact with federal authorities was now helping teach local children about American history during its most dangerous period. "I think that's a wonderful idea, Em. Your grandfather would have loved knowing his work was helping educate young people." Martha watched this exchange with the warmth of someone who'd gained more than she'd expected when she'd first approached 2 strangers in a ranch driveway. She'd come to help preserve local history but had found a family worth joining. That evening, the 3 of them sat on the restored porch swing, watching Wyoming's endless sky fade from blue to gold to deep purple. Emma was reading a letter from Agent Chen, who'd become something of a pen pal since the federal operation concluded. "Agent Chen says they found 3 more sites like Grandpa's," Emma reported. "Other people who protected government secrets for a really long time without getting credit." Tom felt connected to those unknown guardians, ordinary people who'd accepted extraordinary responsibilities because their country needed them. Daniel hadn't been unique in his sacrifice, just uniquely isolated in carrying it alone. "Maybe someday we can help tell their stories too," Tom suggested. Emma's face lit up with the possibility. "We could expand the museum, show how lots of people were heroes even when nobody knew it." Martha squeezed Tom's hand with affection that had grown from partnership into something deeper over their months of shared discovery. They'd built a relationship on mutual respect and common purpose, the kind of mature love that grew from understanding rather than passion alone. "Your father would be proud," Martha said quietly, "not just of what you've accomplished, but of who you've become." Tom looked at Emma, curled against his side, at Martha, whose wisdom had guided them through their darkest moments, at the ranch that had transformed from symbol of failure into beacon of hope. Daniel's sacrifice had cost him his family relationships, but it had ultimately restored them across generations. The brass compass sat on the porch table beside them, its needle pointing steadily north toward mountains that no longer seemed impossibly distant. Tom understood now that some paths were worth taking not because they were easy, but because they led toward truth, honor, and the kind of legacy that made sacrifice meaningful. Emma fell asleep against his shoulder as Wyoming's stars emerged in their full glory, the same stars Daniel had watched during 40 years of lonely vigil, waiting for the day when truth could finally be told. Tom carried his daughter inside to her bedroom, tucking her in beneath quilts Martha had made, and books about heroes, both famous and forgotten. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight their family was complete and their history was clear. Daniel Callahan had been a man worth emulating, and his legacy would live on through the granddaughter who bore his courage and the son who'd finally understood the true meaning of inheritance.